And now it's time for our first panel. It's very aptly titled. It's called Lessons Learned and Aspirations for the Future, Fostering True Disruption. So please welcome to the stage our moderator, Chris Woolard, and he's a partner at EY, and the panelists, Mark Mullen, co-founder and chief executive of Currencycloud, T.S. Anil, CEO of Monzo, Louise Hill, COO of GoHenry, and Joanne Dewar, who's CEO of GPS. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Woolard. I'm a partner at EY, and I lead our fintech practice here in the UK. It's really lovely to see so many people in one room gathered together for Innovate Finance's Global Summit. And I think this is a really important time for us actually to come together. It feels like a moment where fintech is at a bit of a pivot point. We've seen the UK in particular make incredible strides, whether that's across innovators, entrepreneurs, the way capital funds fintech, the way we think about policy and regulation in the UK. But we're also seeing a moment, I think, where there's more and more collaboration across the market, where large traditional players are also, for the first time, really beginning to look at the promise that fintech and regtech can have for the future of their businesses as well. So it's a really brilliant moment for us to take stock, to step back, and to think about what are the things that have worked in terms of the UK's story, but also think about the opportunities and the challenges for the future. So I'm delighted to be joined by a really distinguished panel to think about those issues and talk about them for the next few minutes. So as we wander along the line from my immediate left, we have T.S. Anil from Monzo Bank. We have Joanne Dewar, that's the first one of the day. We have Joanne Dewar from Global Processing Services. We have Mark Mullen, who's CEO of Laven Bank. We have Louise Hill, who's COO of GoHenry. And very much last but not least, we have Mike Laven, who's CEO of Currencycloud. We're going to spend most of our time talking about the future and the opportunities around the future, but I'm going to start with a bit of a reflection of how's life gone to date in the UK. And the first question really to Mark. So thinking globally for a second, what's the UK got right in its journey so far? But also, what are the things and the issues that you think might need to be reopened as we go forward?
Thanks, Chris, and good morning all. I think it's probably the slate grey sky and the weather that's made it so attractive. What's it got right? It has the benefit, and we have the benefit of sitting in one of the world's great cities, which, you know, the cultural and socio-political and economic inheritance of which puts it really in a very strong position in regard to world trade, in regard to finance, banking, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't remove that from, if you like, the general context of fintech, because it provides an incredible foundation. On top of that, it sits, or at least has sat, at the nexus between, you know, the old world and the new. And although that's shifting, nonetheless, it's pretty useful for the UK to have been sitting, I guess, between the States and Europe. And in that context, you've got a genuine set of almost independent initiatives, starting, at least in the context of my journey through fintech, with the Competition Markets Authority, then spooling into PSD, which ultimately then opened into open banking, the Sandbox, the Khalifa Review, any number of different initiatives that are really trying to build upon the ecosystem and the tremendous ecosystem that already exists, and no one of which necessarily will provide a breakthrough or will be, the single answer to everything. but nonetheless, they create the environment, and they're continuing to create the environment to make fintech prosper. And if you measure it looking purely at investment in fintech, you would say that it is prospering and that it has prospered. But for me, possibly the single biggest enabler, and the thing that maybe UK London has gotten right, and I don't know whether it deliberately set out to get it right, is people. That the entire industry is fueled by people and by talent, and that talent doesn't recognize boundary, whether it be political, social, cultural, or national. And a city like London and a country hitherto like the UK has been very welcoming of talent. And that, to me, therefore answers the sort of second part of the question, which is what must it get right into the future? Well, it must continue to get that right in what is a very, very difficult world, and what is now a much, much more straightened, if you like, environment than hitherto has been the case. Because that is the magic ingredient that makes the entire fintech industry revolve and prosper and grow. And making yourself attractive to talent from wherever it comes in the UK and London is probably the #1 challenge that we all face.
I think that's clearly a big issue that's on the agenda. Indeed, we're going to have more about that today. But I wondered if any of the other members of the panel had a reflection on that same subject.
I can go. I mean, it's clear that there's been so much that's happened, and as Mark said eloquently, that it's the coming together of lots of disparate and different initiatives which have this compounding effect. And I loved how he closed as well, which is at the end of it, this is not about just policymakers or regulators or the ecosystem getting things right. Ultimately, it comes down to how people leverage all of that. And what's exciting to me is how fintech companies born and birthed over here are actually leveraging those things to create real scale and create magical outcomes for customers. So that combination of the two hands clapping is what makes it exciting in terms of where we've been.
Thanks. I don't even know if this one's going to work. Can anyone hear me at the back? Yeah, just about. Oh, there we go. Good. That's splendid. It's always going to happen at some point during the day. T.S., while I've got you, actually, I mean, if you think about those things coming together, I mean, there's obviously much to be proud of in terms of what the UK's achieved, and indeed, actually, what firms have achieved sort of globally. There's a session later on today about Ron Khalifa's review looking forward, and that obviously sets out a roadmap for what we might expect to follow. But I mean, if you were trying to pick out, a few of the really important components in your view about the future of the industry in the UK, what would those kinds of issues be?
Sure. I mean, assuming my mic is working. So I think it's important. So I love the fact that we're having the conversation about what next, right? Because the last thing we need is to look back and get complacent because we've gotten a few big things, right? So I love the fact that we're looking ahead, recognizing that we're actually playing catch up with ecosystems like Silicon Valley, which have had decades at this, decades of technology companies and capital and talent all coming together in incredibly good weather as well. So we're playing catch up with all of that, so it's important that we don't get complacent. So if I was to sort of think about the arc of the different things that we need to get right over here looking ahead, let's start with policy. So, open banking, open data, that whole space got legislated over here and clearly set the tone for a whole bunch of similar things around the world. I think it's time to be more ambitious with that stuff. So things like the Smart Data Initiative, which we support, become about taking all of that to the next level and actually setting the tone for the next decade or two. So that's policy. Infrastructure. So, one of the things that we've gotten right in this country is things like the faster payment system, right? And the best kinds of public infrastructure are those that private enterprise can then innovate on and create good outcomes for customers. And faster payments is a great example of where, at Monzo, we built P2P capabilities on the back of that. And the average Monzo customer has 28 friends on Monzo, right? Amongst whom it's easy to make payments and actually live your life. So infrastructure needs to get to the next level. So I think, as an industry, we need good infrastructure around, for instance, combating financial crime, which each of us does our little bits separately, but as an industry, we need to do more. So I think that's the other place where infrastructure will be a massive boost. Regulation. The whole digital banking industry got birthed in the UK because regulators paved a path for startup banks to get licensed. So while we've dealt with the startup piece, the regulation needs to continue to evolve to the scale-up end of the journey now. So regulation needs to be proportionate in ways that are fit for purpose for what is getting built over here, in a way that is not anchored necessarily to the way banks were or technologies the way they were, and the challenges and risks that existed in a different sort of context. So regulation and proportionate regulation would be the other big one. And capital requirements is obviously a big part of proportionate regulations. Capital is another big one. We raised a lot of new capital last year, but I know that raising capital is harder in the UK than it would be in many other parts of the world, and we need to keep making that better and better. And Lord Hill's work and Ron Khalifa's work around the listing regime and so on start to pave that path. So that's another big piece of it. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the signature sort of challenge of our times around sustainability. And here again, I think the industry needs to come together and take a hard, long look at our carbon footprints. Right? Companies like us and other fintech players, most of our carbon footprint is in the supply chain. 99% of our carbon footprint is in our supply chain because we don't run branches and we don't do so many other things manually. But we need to raise the standards for the rest of the industry as well. So, looking ahead, I'm excited because it sounds like a long list of things to do, but it just talks about how the power of solving this in the way that we have in the past can actually take this whole sector to a whole different level as well.
Okay, so that's covered an awful lot of ground. I mean, so in the first couple of questions, we've got the importance of people as the magic ingredient. We've got capital, we've got regulation, we've got infrastructure in there. So Joanne, I'm going to ask you an unenviable question, which is, if we take some of those themes that are already coming out of this conversation, if we think about what we're perhaps seeing in the market begin to develop, so this much greater collaboration and the potential of maybe some of that greater collaboration as well, the connectivity between perhaps larger and smaller players in the market, are there nevertheless spaces where you would see there's a danger that we could slip back here, particularly from a UK perspective? Are there places where you'd like to see the industry kind of pushing forward more or exploring different things?
Thank you. I think the thing that I'm most excited about at the moment in terms of the relationship between the next generation fintechs and the incumbents, if you'll excuse me if I generalize for a moment, but I think the key word is that there's now a proper conversation. And to give a real example to give some light to this, we won an opportunity and got live a digital challenger bank for one of the UK tier ones 3 years ago now. And within that process, the whole of the RFP process was all run by a consultancy. The name of the organisation behind it was unknown until we'd signed. There was no conversation. It was all about RFP box ticking and, have you got these ISO standards and all this kind of thing? Will you meet our thresholds, by procurement to be onboarded as a supplier? And funnily enough, with that programme, we actually got the programme itself into pavement tests, so with live cards, before that bank had onboarded us as a supplier to be able to sign the setup fee. But the pace of change, I think, is now starting to be recognised in terms of, people they're starting to understand they're not just looking for suppliers to be able to enable a product. Because whether it's an FX product 1 minute, a challenger bank the next, then we're going into buy now, pay later, then it's open banking. By the time they're actually sort of completing the design phase, actually the world's moving on. And I think it's starting to be understood that there's enabling organisations such as ourselves who can actually put in place that sort of baseline capability that can support a whole variety of needs that are recognised today, and also have a likelihood of being able to support, continue to support what's needed tomorrow. So what we're seeing finally is being invited to the table to have a conversation about being a true partner. And everyone uses the word partner all the time, but this idea of a true partnership where you're on a journey together, you don't know what's around the corner, but together we can make things happen. And that has been, I think, one of the secrets to success of the fintech scene itself. I mean, I was there on the opening, on the kickoff session for Monzo back in 2014, where Tom assembled all of the partners that had been selected. We all went up to Newcastle and had a whole full day of, this is what I wanted to achieve. How do we make that happen? We did exactly the same with Currencycloud and with Revolut. That was the day one conversation. Bring the partners together. How do we make that happen? And that's starting to now be reflected in the incumbents too.
And is that something that other members of the panel are finding, that that conversation is beginning to shift, that actually people are sort of being more welcoming, or actually are we still sort of stuck in a space that we may have been a few years ago?
No, I think we've all got the message that you can't do it alone, and that whether it's moving money across borders or the banking system or regulation, that the fintech, regtech revolution is across a number of sectors, all of which have to work together in the same way that all of those prior to fintech in London work together. I mean, the ecosystem is what makes everybody strong. And I think the realization of that hasn't gone away. The pressures are there. Of course, we didn't see each other physically, but that seemed to have not gotten in the way. So I think that the point about ecosystem is incredibly important.
And I think it's perhaps worth also saying, I don't think that's limited to the UK. I think that's absolutely a global thing, and it is incumbents, if we use that term, around the world who are starting to approach fintech partners and looking to work with them.
Okay, that's a very positive message to start the morning with. Louise, I want to stick with you for a moment, if that's all right, but I am actually going to ask the rest of the panel as well for their views about this one, and sort of shift direction slightly for a second, which is, over the last couple of years, we've started to talk about fintech for good in a much more sort of structured way. Janine's already referred this morning to what happened during the pandemic, and actually the industry sort of stepping up to some of the challenges there. But what are the spaces where you think actually fintech can do more around that fintech for good agenda?
I think, as you say, I mean, Janine mentioned it earlier, that the way that fintech did what it did best, did what we do best, and responded to the global pandemic and pivoted, did agile things, all those lovely buzzwords, but effectively got loans to small businesses, served people who were stuck in lockdown, and enabled access to financial services. I think going forward, I've been quite excited, no matter what my political leanings, by the government's levelling up agenda. And I think if all of us think as fintech providers what that means, it's what a lot of us do every day. It is enabling access to different groups of people. It's demystifying some of the traditional bastions of opaque financial services and strange language that was used, and bringing that to the public in a way that everybody can access and understand and participate. And I guess you could hardly expect me to sit here today and not mention children. So financial literacy, making sure that we are bringing up a generation of kids who understand money and the way that money works today, so that they grow up able to access and be confident with all of the services that we're all putting out there. I think that's probably, from a terms of sustainability in financial services and in fintech, that's probably the biggest single thing we can do to, dare I say it, change the world.
Cheers.
Yeah, so I love the work that Louise and the team are doing. And from Monzo's perspective, we've always been about this mission of making money work for everyone, which means giving people tools to make good decisions. And fintech shows us the power of bringing that to real life. So we built this tool a few years ago, partnering with our customers, which is a gambling block, right, which effectively allows customers to put a block on funding gambling accounts without a cooling off period. Right? It helped people that were addicted to gambling actually truly manage their money better and come out of being in very, very vulnerable situations. And the impact of that, was talking about the gambling block for those that couldn't hear me at the back. We built this with our customers, and it allows customers to put a block on their accounts so that they can't, in the heat of the moment, top up online gambling accounts. And there's without a cooling off period. 250,000 customers have turned that block on, and only 10% have ever turned it off. Right, which speaks to the power of actually putting a tool in the hands of customers, leveraging technology, and really helping people transform their lives, really helping people manage their money and make it work for them. So like that, I'm sure tools exist across the board, and technology allows us to do this and actually build something sensible and scale it.
If I can add to that, I think that's okay. I think for me, the exciting part about fintech and the financial inclusion agenda is, the inclusion to exclusion is not a continuum. What you have is, you've got this sort of included community in the middle, and there's lots of pockets or communities of, or disparate groups of individuals who are excluded for actually quite different reasons to each other. And what fintech has enabled is to create sort of focused solutions to support those specific groups of individuals, solving for whether it's the fixed address, whether it's about the literacy, whether it's about the age, as Louise does, lots of different reasons that people are excluded. And fintech, because it's been able to pull together technically advanced solutions and have a sort of lower cost to operate, it's been able to really access and enable those groups.
And Mark or Mike?
Listen, at its most basic level, if you go and build a business to solve a problem, then if you want to do any good, then you've got to try and solve the problem better than it's been solved before, or solve a problem that hasn't been solved before. So in other words, just do it better. And I wouldn't underestimate the importance of fintech in that context, which is it adds to competition in an industry that isn't famous for it. It is still an industry or profession that's dominated by some very, very big things. And yes, whilst that's moved a little over the last 6-7 years, materially, it's not moved a huge amount, right? And actually, if you look forward, there's a whole bunch of reasons to believe that big banks will retrench, given the economic environment that we're working in. So offer a better rate, offer a better process, create a better customer experience. Do it better is the fundamental benefit of fintech, and I wouldn't lose sight of it. There's a whole bunch of other things you can do as a business because you have a business, because you have people who work for you, because you have people who choose to buy products and services from you. But they're secondary in a way. You've got to get the fundamental business right, and the fundamental business of fintech is frankly to offer competition and improvement to financial services. And I think it's done a reasonable job of that, but there's still a huge long way to go.
So a number of years ago, in one of the formative meetings of Innovate Finance, I was at a fairly large meeting where the FCA, where the regulator, spoke. And what was really interesting at the time, and I can't remember who spoke, but it was quite senior, that there were two objectives. One objective, of course, which is common to all regulators, is consumer protection. But the other objective was opening up of access. And I think one of the things we've seen in the last number of years in the UK is the regulator having those two objectives, because the opening up of access requires a different approach to risk balanced with consumer protection. And I think that's incredibly important, and is one of the reasons that we've had this burgeoning fintech environment. Many people here, and certainly we do, have relationships with other regulators in the world who don't have that same perspective of those two things in terms of balance. And one of the worries I have going forward is we need to really make sure that we maintain that balance, because the innovation opens access, but it might increase risk. And so that balance between consumer protection and access is incredibly important going backwards, and it'll be incredibly important going forwards.
Thanks very much. And this is probably the sort of possibly the sort of the biggest, or certainly the most sort of strategic question. that I'm going to try and ask this morning to the panel. I'm going to come to you first, Mike, but I'm really interested in everyone's views on this. So we're gathered today for a global summit. If you were to try and pick 2 or maybe 3 things that you think will be the big influences for fintech over the next 2 or 3 years and beyond, what would they be?
Sure, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to say that it's good to see everybody here in person. I like to think that I combine both a dewy-eyed American optimism and having lived for 40 years in London, typical English skepticism when I look at things. So I think there's been 3 or at least 4 major disruptions in the last few years, which makes me think that whatever environment we have looking backwards, we shouldn't assume is the environment going forwards. I'm embarrassed to say that I still have to mention the B word because I'm still dealing in our business with the dislocations of talent, the dislocations of financial supply chains, and the dislocations of regulation that came from Brexit, and those are still alive going forward. The second dislocation was, of course, the pandemic and the lockdown, where accelerated the move to digital, which was great, and moved people to home, which was also great, but in some ways works as a tension with the talent issue of Brexit. On the one hand, it's harder for me to hire people coming in. On the other hand, it's easier for me to put them somewhere else. What does that do to the UK ecosystem? Also, if everybody works from home, what does the concept of clusters mean anymore? I now have people working all over the UK for me as individuals, but I'm not really moving anybody anywhere. So again, that concept is very changed. And then thirdly, the Ukraine, I think as Janine very correctly mentioned, as a major disruption. And that and the, I think UK inflation last month was 8%, going to 10%. Over the weekend, you saw JP Morgan Chase offering 1.5% interest in their bank account. Those of us who've had money in our bank account know that we've been getting 0.25%, and if you have a euro, you've been paying the bank. So once asset prices come down and interest rates go up, does that change consumer behavior? So I guess as I look at a world going forward, I've got, relative to the past 10 years, I've got changed supply chains, different access to talent, a different calculation between debit and credit and how that works. And I wish I had the answer. The answer is, I promised I also wouldn't mention crypto, but I will. Maybe the answer is much more of an acceleration towards digital assets as an alternative way of looking at the world. But I think the important point to me is only that the environment that got us here, and I think as Mark elegantly put, London's major strategic and historical advantages in terms of talent and time zone, the question really to me is, will those same advantages in the same way go forward? We'll have to be smarter. The world has changed dramatically, and in our firm, and I think in the environment itself, we shouldn't assume that what worked will continue to work.
I think I'd like to say, over the weekend I was reading a blog post, and it was inevitably talking about the last 2 years, and the word relentless kept coming up, the relentless changes, kind of one massive global event after another, and the impact that had had on society. And I guess if I'm looking forward to what comes next, I'm not going to use the word relentless, but pace of change, perhaps. You know, we've all talked quite correctly about the last 2 years and the pace of change and how it's accelerated. I don't see that stopping anytime soon. You know, whether that is hopefully not in some of the global events we've seen, but the cost of living crisis that's clearly ahead of us, some of the changes in what that will bring. And also, I think changes in consumer expectations. You know, people expect personalization, they expect bespoke services to be presented to them. And I don't think that's going anywhere. I think that will increase the pace of change. It will put pressure on all of us, but we're probably the best place to deal with that.
I think to add to what both of you have said, I think the where you've mentioned sort of 3 key sort of causes of disruption. I think in our space in particular, there was a 4th, which was the Wirecard crisis, which, you know, we're still, I think, you know, the regulators and the, you know, we're working together to still unpick, you know, what was, you know, what were the bad bits and actually what were the good bits that actually got tarnished by the bad bits, and sort of restore confidence in the, you know, sort of much of how the ecosystem works, particularly around bin sponsorship and the sort of the leveraging of license to enable, you know, so many fintechs. It's been, you know, it's a powerful enabler to get things up and running. To the pace of change, I totally agree. And what I'm seeing is that, sort of from a global perspective, whilst you know, other countries are now looking to replicate, and almost they've got the blueprint from the Khalifa report, you know, what they're trying to achieve from a regulatory perspective, from an availability of capital and talent. Actually, it's still the know-how that that we have. We've got it in spades here, and we're seeing that sort of that pull from markets all around the world to sort of share that know-how to help other markets sort of continue on the same journey to digitalization.
So agree with everything that the other panelists have said. So in the way I think about it, right, you think about the trends that will, to answer your question about trends that will shape fintech. So on the financial services side of it, the reason it's so attractive for innovators to come in, play in it and so on is because the size of the market, the addressable market, the revenue potential, the real problems, the real world problems to be solved at scale is huge. So it's going to attract continued interest. And then on the other side, you have the fact that this is also a regulated industry for very good reasons. All things money need to be regulated in a sensible way. So in my mind, I think what's the dance between new technologies, right? Think Web3, think decentralized finance, crypto sort of being a subset of all of that, new computing technologies, that whole space is going to gallop forward in the coming decade. And the regulatory context is going to keep galloping forward as well, sometimes playing catch up, sometimes leading the way. And I think this sector is going to be defined in the next decade by the interplay between those two things, the interplay between technology and regulation, and the dance between those two things, and will shape outcomes going forward. You know, it's easy to see, even in what we've been observing the last couple of years, crypto has, you know, quite a life of its own, right? Faster than anybody realized, and slower than most people think even right this minute. Regulators have been sort of standing alongside, watching, observing, and will eventually figure out how they want to regulate the space. So how that happens will shape that space. So if you take any subsector of financial services and fintech, that interplay, I think, is what's going to define it, make this the fun industry to be a part of. And the people that win will be those that get technology and get regulation, and can harness the power of both to create great outcomes for customers.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Mark, I'm going to give you the final word.
Well, I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, but not at length, which is, does money follow talent, or does talent follow money? And I really don't know which is which, but the two seem to go hand in hand. And so to me, everything hinges upon creating an environment that attracts talented people. But beyond that, and at a more parochial level, this society and this country and this community needs to start investing in that talent at a grassroots level, because it's pretty unsustainable and expensive to keep believing that you can buy it in, because it's a bidding war. And we've seen the bidding war in the last 2 years, and particularly in regard to change in technology, salary inflation. And that's going nowhere. If anything, that's going to continue and intensify. So you know, trends, challenges for fintech, challenges for banking and financial services, talent. And one other thing to say before I shut up. I'm 32 years in England. I still haven't got a digital identity. And to me, the one most dramatic enabler of competition and disruption in this society would be for us to have a universal digital identity, which would allow me legally to move bank accounts, to move service provider seamlessly. I cannot for the life of me understand how I can have a bloody passport that enables me to cross the globe, but I haven't got a digital identity. And I don't know what's happening with it, because it seems to be a multi-tentacled, but nonetheless not happening thing.
There we go. I mean, I think if you take the themes that were there, I mean, a lot of really, really big themes spanning talent, spanning regulation, spanning how do we fund industry into the future, how do we think about the response to the really big challenges that are coming in terms of the wider economy and wider societal expectations. So I think if you put all of those together, yes, there's an enormous amount of challenges, but also from fintech's perspective, there's also an enormous amount of opportunities. It's great that we'll be back here in person. I hope you enjoy the next 2 days as we pick into and explore those themes in more detail. But can you join me now in thanking our panel for getting it off to a great start?